No matter how good they make technology these days, it never seems to work fast enough, eh? Okay, and we are going live. Welcome, everybody, to this evening's event. A very, very special one. Hang on. I need to mute myself here. There we go. All right. Once again, welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this very, very special Bourbon Heritage Month live tasting event. We have a very special guest with us today, eighth generation Beam family distiller, Mr. Freddie. No, Freddie, welcome.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. It's always great to be talking about bourbon during Bourbon Heritage Month.
I'm sure it's been a pretty busy one for you over the last couple of days.
Oh yeah. I just wrapped up the Kentucky Bourbon Festival here in Bardstown. So yeah, it's been a crazy couple of days. My daughter plays competitive soccer as well. So I was actually juggling events Friday night, and then Saturday juggling time up there, and then driving about an hour to watch her play and then coming back.
So just a quiet time then.
That's right. Pretty easy Saturday and Sunday afternoon.
Yeah, really. And you guys have been able to do the actual Bourbon Fest live this year, right?
Yes. First time. Last year it was canceled, so yeah, it's first time in 2 years we've done it.
It's been nice to kind of say goodbye a little bit to the all the virtual stuff.
Oh yeah. I enjoy it though, because it lets me touch folks like yourselves who most likely it'd be hard for me to probably reach half of this group across travel time, right? So if I would with Zoom, I think it'll become a little bit of a part of what we do, hopefully in the future going forward a little bit. I think the in-person interaction is way more important, but to kind of bridge the gap, I think Zoom has kind of got a place in the world now.
Yeah, I mean,
I'd say it had a place before, but it's got a very prominent place in the world, and probably will stay that way.
Yeah, whoever bought stocks in this stuff early on is doing pretty all right now.
Oh yeah.
So, Freddie, today we're going to touch on 4 whiskeys, a couple of fan favorites, and a couple of new additions to the Beam Bourbon family. First, I kind of wanted to give everybody a little bit of an introduction, I guess, to you. I mean, it's especially talking about this month and kind of paying tribute to the history and the legacy of bourbon. There really hasn't been a family, I think, as intertwined with the world of bourbon than yours over the years. If you want to maybe give everybody a little bit of a background on you, on your family, how the whole Beam and bourbon world became synonymous.
Yeah, I mean, really, it kind of goes back to a little bit before America was a country, around 1755, 54, 56. I don't know that it's exactly documented, but I think there is some notification around 56 that Conrad Beam, who would be Jacob Beam's brother, enlisted in the army here, and signify that our family had landed from Germany around that time. Jacob was born just a little bit later here in America, and then his father passed when he was 6. His mother moved her family back to her brother's farm, where he took a liking to the farming and the distilling. A lot of times, and this is what I say too, is distilling at this time was a farmhand task. And if you go back to this time, everybody was a farmer. So everybody was most likely farming grains for themselves and maybe to sell cattle. Maybe some were doing more of the things than other, and then trading to get those other items. But generally speaking, most people at this time frame had a small skill because they grew grain or procured grain, and if it was going bad, a way to preserve it was to distill it. Right, it becomes a liquid, and then you can. They quickly learned that alcohol kept pretty much forever, right? As long as you kept it away from light and other things, it wouldn't change too much. And it's kind of funny. I did a thing this weekend at the Bourbon Festival about curing ham, and I said bourbon and country ham curing is the 2 biggest things that were passed on in our family. Both of them most likely because they were very prominent parts of Jacob's life. He had become a distiller. Kind of fast forward, He moved to North Carolina, Maryland area. At that time, worked on his uncle's farm, had an opportunity from his uncle to come to Kentucky on a land grant from the government, and basically came on that land grant, moved his family here. It took about 6 years to move. It's kind of crazy. My dad and I missed a flight and got delayed and some issues at the airport. We drove home from that way in about 7 hours. And then it took him almost 7 years to make that track. But
he was some
of the first people to come. Oh, yeah. Well, if anybody ever played the game Oregon Trail on the computer in the early 90s, there was a game where you kind of went across America. It was much like that. You had your animals that were helping you, but it was a treacherous journey. And then getting here, he probably saw a new life for his family. And then I always say, what would he think it would be, coming to Kentucky as a farmer, growing a family. He had quite a few kids, I believe about 11 in total, and became a distiller towards the end of his life cycle, from what my grandfather had told me towards the end of his life. Became more known as a distiller in the area and less about the farming. He also ran the local mill. So if you had grain you wanted ground, you would come to him. So he started a lot of our eye for high quality whiskey, I think, started because of him being a farmer, him also being a millwright and running that mill. He probably saw a lot of bad grain, a lot of good grain, made whiskey from all of it, and it started to pass that on to his son, David Beam, who stayed there. And by the time David was a distiller, Jacob had about 100 acres. David had about 800 acres. So they had grown the distillery, grown the grounds for growing grain, and the area was becoming to know about Beam whiskey, and it started to ship around the country around this time as well, down the river. And then just to go, Jacob and David stayed there in what's close to Springfield, Kentucky. And then David M. Beam, who would be David's son, the third generation of family to be a distiller in Kentucky. In around 1856, he moves the family's distillery to Nelson County, where there's a railroad that's come through, and he literally buys land adjacent to the railroad. And this is where you start to see Beam whiskey really come across America, because we could start to move it a lot further than just on boat down the river. You were kind of tied to where the water was going. This railroad was going to many stops across the country and really started to help us get our whiskey out there. At this time, the whiskey, I see a bottle behind you, Ray, Old Tub was what it was called. So from 1795, I don't know that it was Old Tub then, but Jacob started making whiskey here in Kentucky in 1795, and that's kind of where we claim our start, because he was probably making whiskey before in Maryland, but in coming here, it's kind of where we say he started his family and everything. So in 1795, just 19 years after the U.S. has become a country, my family kind of starts making whiskey, and has been, to your point, has been at it ever since. And to get you up to David M. Beam, he took a big move by moving us to the railroad. His son was Jim Beam himself, who is on your hat, and this first whiskey we're going to taste as well. It's named for. And why the name changed from Old Tub to Jim Beam was because of the man Jim Beam and his reputation, not only as a distiller, but really as a community man, a man who helped a lot. He actually, where this distillery was that David M. Beam bought or land was connected to the Sisters of Charity of Nazareth, a Catholic nunnery. And they had a drought and there was very little water, but Jim Beam had a very good water source for making whiskey. So in this summertime, he actually piped water over to the nunnery for these sisters to have water. And my granddad said that the story was that those nuns prayed for Jim Beam's whiskey distillery to not burn down, and that Jim Beam is a successful man because of his. And that's just one story of how Jim Beam was as a man, not to mention the fact that he kind of scaled the Great Depression, World War, This other thing called Prohibition, where he wasn't even allowed to make whiskey. Towards the very end of his career, that happened. So at 70 years old, coming out of Prohibition, Jim Beam not only gets our distillery up and going in 120 days at 70 years old, with the help of his nephews and son, but these guys were 14 and under when Prohibition started. And then you think 13 years later, you got a 25 to probably, I think the youngest one was around 16 to about 27. And you got this old man who's trying to teach these young fellas that this whiskey thing is important, right?
Yeah.
They don't know what the hell whiskey is. And to know that he did that, got it going in 120 days, that really is a lot of why our flagship brand and the world's number one bourbon is named for him. He helped reinstill those quality marks I talked about from before, about knowing good quality grain, good quality water, instilled that in his son Jacob and his nephews, some of which go on to other distilleries like Park Beam at Heaven Hill. Others go on to work at other distilleries as well. You know, at the Dant family distillery was a couple of beams from Jim's nephews that he taught. And so a lot of it was he was doing this and teaching these guys about this, and they latched onto it, started to get a footprint. And where you see a lot of globalization was where Jim Beam's son, Jerry Beam, or T. Jeremiah Beam, came in. He really liked to travel and started to kind of mingle pleasure and business. He would go to new countries, have a lot of business dealings with the government and talk about bringing Jim Beam in, but also he would like to sightsee. So he would do that with his wife after he had his meetings. And really, we dedicated a room on our campus to him and showcased a lot of the areas and timeframes when he moved us into these countries across his tenure, about 160 countries, just while my great uncle Jerry was at. So, and some of that stems from a good story on him. Some military folks during Vietnam were writing back, and also during the Second World War were writing home saying, "We love Jim Beam, but we can't find it anywhere over here. They don't have any whiskey." So he began just shipping pallets to the servicemen at the stations. And then they would go out in bars and say, "You guys got to get this shit, man. You know, we're drinking this, and we come out to you. We're not coming out to the bar." And so they would start writing the government. So that's how it all really got going. Was our family has always had a big sense of pride for the military, and because of that, it kind of led to that, you know, and led to us being spread overseas, and kind of got on my Uncle Jerry's brain moving, I'm sure, when he started seeing what was going on. So he was supplying the servicemen, and then the others were kind of calling saying, "Hey, these guys are drinking this stuff. We want it. How do we get it?" Very synonymous with bringing about Jim Beam to the world's number one bourbon, which happened during his tenure, really as him and my grandfather was doing a lot of the distillery stuff at that time. And that's where it kind of switches. Jerry had no children. Jim Beam had two daughters and a son. One daughter, Mimi or Mildred, had no children. T. Jeremiah had no children. And Margaret, my great grandmother, happened to be the only one that did have children. And my grandfather, Booker, was very close with his grandfather, and his mother and Uncle Jerry were very close siblings. And she asked that he bring my grandfather into the industry. And his Uncle Jerry said, "Yes, I'd like to do that." And once my granddaddy got there, it was kind of, you know, they say like a cow to cud. It's a term around here, you know. It just, he took to it and was dedicated to it for a very long time. He started in about 1952 at Boston, or at Claremont. About 4 years later, we bought a new facility because of how the bourbon growth was going at that time. So you see a very, you know, a big rise of bourbon before Prohibition. You have Prohibition where it's dead. You see my family kind of sticking through it, helping bring it back after Prohibition. And then you see my grandfather helping expand it in his early years. And then really at the late 70s, after this expansion had started and my grandfather had really started this second facility up and became a master distiller, it started to fall off again. Right about the time Jim Beam became the number one bourbon, bourbon became not so popular. And with that, we shut down the plants a lot more, and it kind of starts to tease and transition into some of our other tasting three products that is more around innovation, where if you talk about Jim Beam kind of being the flagship and the one that has been the test of time. This is the family recipe for over 225 years now. These other things kind of stemmed from the first one being Basil Hayden, stemmed from my grandfather having the opportunity to do some innovation time during this downfall of bourbon in the 80s. He created Booker's first, the first uncut, unfiltered bourbon. I think pretty much the first uncut, unfiltered whiskey. There's some debate on whether there was a Scotch that had been uncut from the barrel, but I'm not sure if we ever got resolution on that. But definitely the first American whiskey uncut. And he was going back to the way bourbon was meant to be and used to be in his eyes, or was meant to be in his eyes and used to be. And that's how Jim Beam and before him sold whiskey, straight from the barrel. You bring your jug to the plant, fill it up, and that was that. And you go on your way. So Granddaddy wanted to go back to that, give people that flavor straight from the barrel and let you guys drink it and choose to cut it with water or whatever you wanted to make it pleasing to your palate, the way whiskey used to be. And that's what started really the premium whiskey category. Granddaddy started Booker's, and then 3 years later came out with Basil Hayden, Knob Creek, and Baker's in 92. And with that, we call that the small batch collection. Well, now small batch bourbon is a huge portfolio within the bourbon category. And he started with Booker's, just wondering, was there a market for high proof, even a little bit more expensive, like a $50 bottle of bourbon was even worth it. It's kind of laughable today, a $50 bottle of bourbon. That's kind of mid-range in a lot of, if you probably looked at the median, but so it worked. The premiumization of bourbon brought more people into bourbon again. There was a lot more flavor that was present. And so my grandfather really creating that, and then in the later part of his career, teaching my father about what he had done, and my grandfather getting out on the road and selling those four products and educating consumers about what bourbon was all about. I've done quite a few seminars in person and out of person, and very few of them have I had to talk about what goes into bourbon. Corn, 51% corn, must be made in America. And I attribute my dad, and there's other guys like Jimmy Russell at Wild Turkey, Parker Beam and Craig Beam at Heaven Hill that were out there as well. But my dad and those guys getting out there and educating people about those things and what the flavors that were coming through were about and how to drink it. Or in our case, telling the consumer that there is no way to drink it. It's the way you want to drink it. Those things really open people's eyes to bourbon. And here we are, very, very close to as popular. And that's what's kind of crazy. As popular as today, it's still not as popular as it was in the late 60s. So we're right on the cusp of that based on how this thing's gone. It's given me an opportunity to come into the industry and have an influence in innovation at a young age. But a lot of that, I was very drawn to the distillery like my grandfather. And when I was in there, I spent so much time asking questions and learning how things worked. And now I feel like a lot of my role is getting to a place where I can do things like this and educate people on some of the different offerings of whiskey we have. Maybe tell how we got where we are, because I think it's important what we just went through. That history of bourbon is very important on where it's going for consumers and folks like myself, makers. So continuing that education, but also the opportunity to take those levers and the knowledge of 225 years of distilling and kind of reapply some of those quality marks and quality levers, whether it be with grain, with some of the things we're going to talk about with Basil Toast, maybe proof differentiations, age differentiations like we've done on Knob Creek and Bakers with 13-year Bakers, 12 and 15-year Knob Creek. But it gives me the opportunity to go in the warehouse and look for things that are differentiated. And really what my role looks like is finding a bourbon that's out there for everyone. And I think that is the truth. There is a bourbon out there for everyone, and getting it in those people's mouths. That's what I enjoy about it. And I spent a lot of time in my young career learning the whole facility. So that's how I started out. I did a few internships, one in marketing, one in the operation. And in the operation, I bounced around from distillery to warehouse, granary, bottling, processing, research and development. And coming out of college, my dad asked me what I wanted to do. And I told him I wanted to do everything. I loved how everything worked together, and I wanted to know more about all of that. And I think it just being a curious young person, it set me up for success. You know, I didn't even know. I was just wanting to kind of fulfill my need, and everyone laughed at the plant because they're like, no one does that. But they found a way to allow me to fill in as a supervisor in these areas, kind of help the team build up some of their safety protocols, sometimes maybe new process implementation, but gave me that opportunity to understand the operation from head to toe, front to back, in and out. And like I said, just being a dumb kid wanting to do everything and not be stuck in one spot, it set me up for success in so many ways, because I have such a great eye for this whole thing. You know, whereas a lot of times in a big corporation, you kind of come in and we have a job in the distillery and you may just stay there. That's what my dad did a lot. He stayed in the label room and bottling for about 15 years, then went to the distillery and learned for a while. Then it came his time to get into other things. But a lot of that time, bourbon was unpopular. So like I said, having the dedication to learn, it worked out well for me. And being so proud of carrying on everything we went through right there, that 225 years of history, and talking about it, teaching people that, you know, not only has a Beam kind of watched over Jim Beam and now the extensions of Jim Beam for 8 generations now, but really kind of back to your point and when you first kicked off of, there's been a Beam overseeing the bourbon industry and helping make sure that it didn't die. Because I can promise you, my granddad had said there was times where he didn't think this bourbon thing would be around. That's what he said. I didn't think bourbon would be around. You know, I didn't know if the next day would be the last day, or if that would be the day I found out about the last day. So hearing him say that, and my dad kind of talk about how granddaddy felt about it, it's really beefed up my. I'm probably the biggest pain in the ass as far as a quality marker when it comes to the distillery. I'm just a very stickler about a lot of details, because if the quality falls off, we don't want to go back through what we've been through, right? Of shutting the distillery down, sales going down. Bourbon has a lot of flavor and deserves to be shared, I feel like. So keeping the quality bar set high, keeping the flavor profiles in the right directions, and keeping this thing moving is kind of what it's all about for me. And having these opportunities is like a 1+. So yeah, it's kind of 226 and a half years of Beam, not only bourbon history, but really kind of early settlers moving across the country. And really, when Jacob came to Kentucky, you know, he wasn't far from some of the first folks to really kind of hit that gap, the Cumberland Gap, as they call it, going across the Appalachian. He was really some of those first, people besides the surveyors that were going to see what was over there. So going out, setting out, getting his land. It's just crazy to think that he did that, probably just trying to set up his own land, right? Because as a nephew to a guy who owns a farm, all you're ever going to do is work for your uncle, right? At that time frame, he wasn't going to be anything else, but he got an opportunity. He kind of latched that opportunity, and it led to so many more opportunities for his family, from, Jim Beam, all of them, all the way through to myself, and still giving me opportunities today. So a lot of people ask the question, who would you have a drink with of your ancestors if you could? Because really, I've only had one with my dad. My grandfather passed when I was 16. It's a very tough one because I was so close with my granddad, and so much of what I do is trying to honor some of the things he taught me about life and whiskey. But it would be tough between him, Jim Beam, because how did he recognize what bourbon was so much about to bring it back? And then Jacob, because I just want to tell Jacob what we just went through. I was like, here's what your family did. What do you think about that and where it is? And just see the reaction he would have. So that's a tough one for me, but one I like to always bring up that people ask is, who would you have a drink with? It'd be very tough between the three of them because they're such strong linchpins and doing that. And really, I guess the one I chose before, I've thought about before and chose, I had talked about T. Jeremiah because he worked with my grandfather as a young booker, and saw him for quite a bit of his career before he passed away. He also learned from his father quite a bit, a lot of his career. And then his grandfather, David M. Beam, who was the one who moved the distillery and then helped Jim get into it, lived until T. Jeremiah was about 17 years old. So he heard some stories. So even though I'd say I'd love to talk to Jacob, Jim, or Booker, I'd probably, if I were being tactical about it, probably be best to talk to T. Jeremiah because I could really touch every generation except for David and Jacob.
Yeah.
So that'd be pretty cool. One night after I was on a Zoom, I'd had a few drinks before the Zoom was going, and then we had a long Q&A session. And someone asked that question. After it was over, I got to thinking about it, and I got to thinking, who would I pick? And then I said, well, you know what? I said Jacob, Jim, or Booker, but I'd pick T. Jeremiah. And I was kind of upset that I didn't get to share that with the group that kind of made me.
Well, I guess you're right. He did really have that kind of front row seat to some of the most pivotal people, not just in your family, but in the history of bourbon, really, as a whole.
Yeah, because I'm sure he heard, because David M. being Jacob's grandson, he probably heard a lot of stories from his dad, David, about his dad, Jacob, and how he came to Kentucky. So I'm sure Uncle Jerry heard quite a few stories about just that, coming to Kentucky. He probably heard about the early days of whiskey making. He heard about the move from David M. He learned Prohibition probably very firsthand as a young boy, and then helped shape after Prohibition, and then shaped my grandfather into who he was, really. So T. Jeremiah is a pretty big piece of it. And just from the I would say he's the biggest knowledge keep, where the guys that kind of peppered around him were big, strong figures in the quality of the whiskey.
Freddie, you'd made kind of a passing comment there about how bourbon you want it to be shared. You want this great quality whiskey to be shared. We're going to do some of that today. We're going to share 4 whiskeys that we'll kind of run through a little quickly. Some of them certainly leaning a hell of a lot more towards the innovation style of things, and I guess moving away from I guess what you might call quote unquote traditional styles of bourbon making. But I think a good place to start is usually with the tradition and with the namesake bourbon, the flagship. So we've got Jim Beam White here. Yeah,
I mean, I think we talked a lot about my Uncle Jerry right there. He was the one who, with the help of some marketing folks, wanted to change the name from Old Tub, being the kind of prominent name sold, to Jim Beam as an honor to the man. And then he got it out there. So Jim Beam has been that staple for our family. 4 years old, 80 proof. I think you get on the aroma right away. You get some sweetness coming through from the corn, hints of some sweetness coming from the barrel, and very similar across your palate. It's not overpowering. You get a little bit of oomph from the barrel coming through, a little bit of the alcohol content, but generally Jim Beam has kind of set the standard for a very, in today's world, has become a very good high standard of entryway bourbon. If you've never had bourbon, the first 2 we're trying, in my opinion, would be the first 2 you should try in the whole industry, not just Beam. And I'm maybe a little bit partial, but I think a lot of people who would be impartial, take my competitors, I'm sure they've got brands they would say, but take an impartial viewpoint, I think a lot would say Jim Beam and Basil would be two you'd want people to have early, because it's starting to introduce you to some of those flavors. They're not overly complex, but it starts to set the tone for what bourbon is about. That's what I love about Jim Beam. It really sets the tone to me for what bourbon is about, the flavor profile and the entry into that kind of higher proof. Right, I mean, a lot of people, if they're drinking vodka, they're probably not drinking it straight. They're drinking it in a cocktail, so it's a little bit lower proof. Yeah, so it does, and that, so like I said, I think on the profile of Beam, you're getting a lot more corn sweetness, a little bit of sweetness from the barrel.
I think that's one thing that, you know, always really stands out to me with this whiskey. And one of the things I probably love most about it is that for sure you do get to get some of those, the influence from the wood. You get some of those nice wood sugar flavors, but you still also have the grain being, you know, nice and prevalent. And it really, it's such a great, you know, showcase for, as you said, a family recipe that's been around for 225 plus years.
You think about it too. We perfected this recipe at 4 years old. We had sold at 2 years old for Old Tub before. And then Jacob and David were probably selling much younger version of it. When we talk about recipes, kind of grain bill, and kind of how we go about making the whiskey. And so there's just a lot that goes into that right there. That profile at 4 years old, at that time, people were selling mostly 2-year-old whiskey when we decided to go 4-year on Jim Beam. But it gets to a place where you're getting more flavor from the barrel, not just from the grain. And so at that time, it was really setting a bar and a standard. One of my favorite ads was an ad of Jim Beam. There's two of them very similar. One of them, Beam, no finer whiskey in all this world, yet moderately priced. Because that's what it was always about, getting whiskey in people's mouths. It wasn't about big price points. And that was what it was about. And then the other one was, 4-year Beam whiskey, 4 years old, aged twice as long as the law requires. And it was a big point at that point, because you're thinking about it, it's coming out of Prohibition, and we're waiting 2 additional years because of a quality mark to set a standard. And we did. We set the standard, and it became the world's #1 bourbon when he set that standard with it. And I think it is because it starts to pull more flavor that's from the barrel and from the grain. You're getting a little bit of a mix there. Where our next one that we'll kind of walk into, with the Basil Hayden. So we double the rye. So the sweetness from the corn, Jim Beam's playing in the 75 and above % grain. We double the amount of rye. So the grain bill on Basil drops the corn below 70% into the 60s. So you're getting less sweetness influence from corn. You're getting a little bit of spice from the rye. But what I think as I'm pouring this Basil here, what I think is unique about Basil is you start to pick up some more flavors from the barrel at a little bit younger age. So we're sitting this at a little bit around a 6-year profile. It's a little bit older than Beam, get a little more complexity from the barrel, but a little bit more rye content. It adds a little bit different mouthfeel coming across your palate, adds a little bit of a spice on your palate, but that extra age gets a little more flavor coming from the barrel. And this one is really in a sweet spot for what I think today's consumer, as a kind of a step in, a little bit of a step in, I guess I would say, for the industry, in flavor and complexity. And it delivers that. And in 80 proof, I think if you taste people that like Basil at 80, you probably wouldn't like it at 100 or 120. I do a lot of work with our whiskeys and taste them at different proofs. It's really good, but it is so different. It comes off very soft here across the back of your palate. It's very pointed at a very strong proof. That's what I really like about Basil, is it's kind of playing in that step in, step up role, where it's a little more complex, flavor's a little bit deeper, a little more spice, a little more across your palate. But generally speaking, it's still very approachable whiskey. And you'll see that across the line. We're going to taste one of actually my first innovation on Basil next, But even across some of the ones my dad and I worked on, and then the ones he was working on as well before that, they were all about approachability with certain niches, whether it was a rye whiskey or bringing a little influence from some Caribbean rum to maybe get some people that really like the rum to buy into the bourbon and try it. But all about approaching bourbon with a different viewpoint. And that's what Basil's really become for us, is a way into bourbon with a little bit of an elevated flavor complexity from the kind of base. And it's done a great job and working very well in a very great position. And I think it does that because it delivers a lot of what people like to see in a flavor.
100%. And it is that great little kind of, as you said, that step in for people who maybe aren't, the everyday bourbon drinker, because it gives you across all those, traditional flavors you're expecting, but it does so in a very, very subtle.
Yes.
I don't know if I want to say delicate, because there's definitely still a lot of complexity to it, but it doesn't have that heavy hit.
It doesn't hit you in a lot of pointed. A good word I've utilized is rounded. It's very round.
Okay, yeah.
None of the flavors of Basil really spike out. The complexity's there, but it doesn't take you to extremes of any of them. It gives you, almost to your point, little subtle hints of a little bit of that spice, a little bit of that sweetness. Maybe is that coming from the barrel? Is it coming from some grain? Great soft finish. I mean, there's just a lot of like I said, it's kind of rounded. That's what I would use to describe it. It's just, if you put the flavors on a wheel, they're not spiking in any direction further than the rest. It's a complete circle.
Nice. So for anybody who is here in the Canadian market, who's watching along, whether it's live now or after the fact, much like we've seen over the last year or two with the Knob Creek brand, with Baker's, which is certainly a huge fan favorite up here across Canada, and also with the Legion brand, we are seeing a little bit of a change in the visual, I guess, of Basil Hayden. We haven't had them roll out right here in Canada yet. Freddie, I don't know if do you have the new bottle with you in front of you there?
But yeah, I have both.
So this is what
the first one
are used to here in Canada.
Got the old Basil pack. The first that rolls out in the new pack is the next one with it, which is the one I just poured, the Basil Hayden Toast. So that's the first one you'll see. I think you got one sitting back there on your shelf. Yeah. Oh, there's one too. So
we got some toast.
Got that. Yeah. But then next, we're going to roll out the new version of that package you just showcased, the original Basil. I do have that right here with me as well. So it's similar to the toast and a lot of the elements. We got the side label there with some tasting notes and things. Cork is similar, very similar to toast, just a little closer, just a little bit differentiated color from that Basil you were holding there.
So definitely something to look out for on the shelves. I know we're hoping to have it rolling out. Obviously, every province is going to be different with the speed at which it comes out, but certainly if you are stopping to see the old kind of bib bottles, you'll certainly start to see the new bottles of Basil Hayden rolling through. And after mentioning toast, there, this is one that we got a sample bottle sent through up here a while back, one of the plastic bottles from the distillery. And first time I got a chance to taste it, I was mind blown. I mean, I'm a big Basil Hayden fan. Have been I think since the first time I tasted it. But toast is really bringing something very new to the game. Tell us a little about.
Yeah. So one thing first, two elements of toast that I really got to put my mark on is early in my career in the distillery, my dad was traveling. We were looking at doing an innovation mash bill that we had created before in the signature craft line called Brown Rice. They asked me to go down to Arkansas and kind of help pick out and procure the grain and learn a little bit about it. Not only for marketing purpose, but for distillation, because I was working in the distillery. So I kind of did some learning with them, learned about the softness of rice in general versus rye and wheat. It's even softer than wheat. So then I got that in my head as I'm making this whiskey. It's aging out. Last year I had an opportunity to be asked to work on a new product for Basil. And I said, can I kind of go square one and kind of recreate what I think Basil stands for? And that's approachability within the industry and bringing new people in. And my boss said, absolutely. Let us know when you're ready to taste some things. And so what I did was I took that brown rice bourbon, where very similar profile to the to the Basil Hayden bourbon recipe, where it's less than 70% corn. We replaced the rye with brown rice and still utilize the malted barley. We aged it about 4.5 years. We then take it, put it in a secondary cask that I worked on with. This is where the other part of my work came in, was working with our barrel maker, Independent Stave, to create a toast profile that I really liked. Because toasting this barrel, it's kind of like cooking meat. If you cook it fast or slow or anything really, different ways of cooking things affects the flavor. Same with toasting and charring barrels. So we toasted the second barrel to a profile that pulls out what we call confectionery sweets, which is very vanilla forward, almost some powdered sugary notes really as well. And so we aged it in that vessel a little under half a year. We then took our brown rice bourbon and then blended back some of that toast char finish. So that was the other thing. I wanted to keep the aging going. Toasting will be very pointed in the flavor it develops. So we toasted the wood, then we flash charred it very quickly to get another char back on there so that the whiskey would continue to age normally, as well as picking up these pointed notes of the toast. And so that's what you see is a whiskey that's got a lot of flavor for around a 5.5 to 6 year bourbon, but it starts to pull some notes from something a little bit even older. You get some vanilla coming through, and those notes come from a little bit older whiskey. But because that brown rice is a little bit softer, it's starting to let that whiskey interact earlier with the barrel and get some of those complex notes. And then when you cut it to 80 proof, it's very approachable. It kind of pulls away. There's not much spice there. So to me, it's like the ultimate, I'm a little partial because I did the work on it, but it's kind of the ultimate approachability in the flavor that it's delivering. It's taken away a little bit more of that spice note, but it's delivering more complexity. So there's more complexity, a little less spice. I think it makes people, if it's their first sip or second sip of bourbon, be a little bit more curious about what there is to offer based on what there is in this glass versus something that, a little bit of that spice may turn them off. This doesn't tend to have that.
It is a really, truly remarkable whiskey. I think it's something that when we see the products that have done really well here in Canada, I think this one is kind of going to fit right in line with all of that. For anybody looking to buy some of this, we are expecting it to roll out over the course. Really between now and December-ish. Each province, each liquor board is going to be a little bit different, but certainly do keep your eyes out. Also, if you follow on the @Beam Bourbon Canada Instagram page, I'll make sure to update y'all as this stuff starts to roll out. Freddie, we do have one more whiskey we wanted to talk to really quickly before we take any questions. And that is, I think whenever anybody thinks Freddie No, I think probably the first whiskey that's going to jump into the mind is going to be the Little Book series. Here in Canada, we have had chapter 2 through 4 so far release. We didn't have any chapter 1 come through, but we will have chapter 5 launching again. The same thing around about the same time. We're expecting toast to hit each market, and I know there's a lot of people who are really interested to find out what the story behind chapter 5 is.
It was quite interesting. It was a U.S. only launch. Just to kind of fill it out, there was probably a little more skepticism than I probably even thought. I knew there was some skepticism with us releasing a blended whiskey in the company, but I think there was a little bit more than even I thought, and probably definitely more than everyone in the consumer world thought about releasing this. They didn't know if it'd be well received, given that it was, a $100 bottle of blended whiskey, which hadn't had a good term in America. So we started small in America and just were trying to fill out the consumer. And in working with chapter 2, which had Canadian whiskey, I come to learn that there were quite a few people who were upset that it wasn't released in Canada, and they were very, I guess with blended whiskey having a little bit more kind of good faith in Canada, there was quite a few people that they were a little bit upset that it just didn't show up. So they called me and said, "Do you want to give Canada allocation on Chapter 2?" And I said, "You know what? I've been meaning to ask you all how we can get some allocation there." They're like, "Well, it was a U.S. launch only, but with it using Canadian whiskey, we think there could be a market and the storytelling element there." And I said, "Well, I've done had a lot of complaining, so yes, I'm totally on board with that." So that's how you got in the door. And then the next year they said, "Well, do you want to give them Chapter 3?" And I said, "Well, if they were upset about not having Chapter 1, and then we give them Chapter 2, I guess to be honest, the liquid on Chapter 3 was a little bit tighter than Chapter 3 was tighter than Chapter 2. They're like, maybe we could scale back Canada." And I said, "No way." They complained. I answered, "I'm not changing it. No way." So, and like I said, there's been a lot of great reception from it. So it's well deserved to be released in Canada. So no
well
worries.
done, Canada.
It's always on the board.
I guess being the squeaky wheel helps.
So, yeah, I mean, I think, that's what kind of got it there. But what's cool about Little Book, it started as my coming out party. You know, really, I've had a lot of work on I've worked a lot with Dad on the Baker's revamp. Obviously, Basil Toast is my own. I've been involved in some of the other Basil innovations, the Knob Creek innovations, things along that nature. But Little Book was kind of the first thing I got a chance to work on. And coincidentally, it was something I wanted to kind of be curious. I was very curious about how really it stemmed from, we used corn, rye, and malted barley in our mash bill when we cook the grain and then distill it. I was so curious. I wondered what would happen if you used straight corn, straight barley, and straight rye whiskeys and then blended them to that profile of the mash bill. Would it taste like bourbon? Would it taste like Jim Beam? And it kind of turned into what Little Book is, in a place for me to take my granddad's thought of any, of it being uncut, unfiltered, the way whiskey was used to be and the way it's meant to be in his eyes. And then something a curiosity of mine of that blending session. And then really giving that opportunity to let people enjoy it any way they want at cask strength. So it's very fitting that our first kind of foray into something new is an opportunity for that consumer to enjoy it any damn way they please, from cask strength all the way down to whatever that be. And so a lot of that inspiration from Little Book came from my grandfather, and that cask strength, I think it's very fitting, because with blending, it's another way for me to put together releases that are very pointed in what they're trying to do and differentiate flavor profiles. And then when the consumer receives that bottle, they can add water, mix it in a cocktail, add ice, or any of the above combinations to create what they like. And that's what I love about it, is it's me putting it to a place that I enjoy. I think the consumer will enjoy it multiple ways. And then it's kind of a listening game of how consumers have enjoyed it. And yeah, so here you are in Chapter 5, the invitation. Why it's called that is 3 of the 4 whiskeys in here were made either on my time as a distillery supervisor, or I led the project with the malted rye, which is in there. It's kind of a newer innovation mash bill. That's one that I was really proud to work on and distill. It was a very differentiated mash bill, and you see it does well for a blended whiskey because it's adding a different element that you haven't seen before in American whiskey. It's 100% malted rye at 3 years old. There's a 5-year-old Jim Beam based bourbon at cask strength that basically was made as I was a supervisor in the distillery. And then the youngest one is a 2-year bourbon that I curated, a younger, lower proof off the still, allow some more flavor to come through from the barrel, some oiliness coming through from the little bit more corn action coming off of the still as well, a little more corn flavor. And it adds a great, robust mouthfeel to this blend. And then it's finished off with just a little bit, it's the lowest component, a 15-year Jim Beam. That's aged in one of our historic rack houses right in the middle great flavor coming through, kind of like a very nice, sweet, dark cherry. If you could taste the 15-year on its own, it's like a very rich, dark cherry bomb that goes off. And I think in this chapter 5, you get hints of that across the front and the back of your palate. That mouthfeel really incorporates a lot of your mouth in the tasting, and you're getting a lot of different toasted notes and toasted elements coming through from that malted rye as well.
Fantastic. Well, I know for one, I'm definitely looking forward to getting my hands on a bottle of that as soon as it comes out up here in Canada. Freddie, we've got a couple of minutes left, and I certainly don't want to keep you too long because I know you've had a long couple of days with the Kentucky Bourbon Festival down there. If anybody on the call has any questions, if you just want to toss your name into the chat, and I'll roll back around to you. We do, as I said, have a couple of whiskey groups and a couple of different bars across the country who are watching live via YouTube, who had submitted some questions beforehand, as it was just going to be a little bit easier, I guess, from a logistic point of view of just using YouTube. So a couple here, Freddie. One that I think I thought was actually a really cool one was, of all the projects that you've worked on so far, what has been your favorite one, or the one that stood out to you most as being like, that was cool?
So there's one that's coming out that I can't say a damn word about yet, but I'll be honest with you, is my absolute favorite. And when you see the story and what it's about, and you read about it and you hear about it, it'll instantly click in your head the one I'm talking about. And then when you read the story, so I'm hoping that everyone out there's eyes and ears perked up and they look for it. It's a new release, a new brand we're actually creating. Very small release, probably a distillery only early on, but called Hardin's Creek, which is a place where Jacob started making whiskey. That's where Jacob Beam landed in Kentucky. Not going to go any deeper into the first release, so there'll be multiple releases on this brand, but you'll see that first release we do on that. It has been my favorite project for a number of reasons. But if you took that one away, that it, and that one's just kind of wrapping up, so it's fresh and very important. But the I would say if you take that one off, probably the work I did on Booker's 30th with my dad. We go into taste. We had earmarked this 15-year whiskey that was Booker's, and we were very excited to try this whiskey. And we tasted it, and we just weren't excited about what it was offering. And so we come back, get some 10-year-old Booker stock as well, create a kind of a batch of 2 different Booker's lot codes, and got to a place we absolutely loved it. And so to me, it was very fitting that we actually had launched the PR campaign. Everyone had already thought it was locked in. The 15-year product was going to be what it was and told folks. So we backtracked. It was a great story because it was me and my dad kind of standing up to the voices that had already locked this thing in, saying we can't do that. And it was us standing up saying, for the quality of the whiskey and the quality of the brand, we need to reformulate this. We went with it. And so, yeah, I would say that's one I'm very proud of. And outside of this newest one, that one there really meant a lot to me because we did it. We got the job done, and everyone was so happy with the finished product too.
Awesome. That's also one hell of a way to tee up a teaser for a new release.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
I can feel my inbox exploding already. I guess this one is probably almost the opposite of that. Like, what do you think has been the most challenging part of your career so far in bourbon?
So there's another project that maybe won't ever see the light of day I've been working on that I'll say is the most challenging. If it does come out, I'll be glad to come back on and tell you all a little bit more about it and why. But that one probably not going to make the light of day come out, so no one will see it. So sorry about that. That one's probably definitely the worst. And because it's not coming out, it kind of adds the icing on the cake of why it's the worst. But I'd say chapter 2 was the toughest because I had learned, I had smelled whiskey from a young age with my grandfather. As I came into the distillery, I began tasting whiskey, most of it being bourbon, all of it being American whiskey. I started in my young career to travel and learn our sister plants in Canada, but hadn't had a lot of exposure to it until chapter 2, and then working with it and working with American whiskey. There was a lot of work that had to be done, keeping keeping everything together, keeping the complexity level high, keeping the flavors that were prominent in American whiskey and Canadian whiskey relevant to the blend. It was the toughest thing I had worked on, especially at that time, and it has withstood the test of time outside of this project that probably won't come out. As the toughest one, because it was one coming off the heels of the first release. You want to kind of keep setting the bar high. Maybe I was a little bit nervous because the length ended up getting to a place I really loved with it, but there was a lot of stuff that kind of led to that being that toughest kind of scenario, if that makes sense.
Well, it worked because it's damn good whiskey. All right. I think the last question to close it out here tonight. And this one I thought was a really cool one, because I'd say you could probably ask every distiller in the world this question. You're going to get a different answer from every single person. What do you think is the number one key to creating a great bourbon?
The number one thing I would have to say, it goes back to, it's got to be two things: quality ingredients and constant monitoring and understanding of your process. So getting the quality ingredients is one thing. Running a consistent product and understanding the upset points of your system makes the outcome of those quality grains even higher quality and consistent. So I think those two things, if you're using high quality ingredients and you know how to make whiskey, or you know how you want to make the whiskey and you stick to that, or you know what you need to do to stick to that, those are the things that matter the most. There's a lot of elements that are variable. The barrel is a big variable. The aging process changes the whiskey so much, and each barrel itself is its own kind of microclimate. So there's a lot of work that is not in your hands. So you need to make everything you can as consistent as possible up front.
Yeah, sorry, I think we may have dropped you there for a second. Okay, we got you. Cool. All right. Well, listen, we don't want to take up any more of your time, Freddie. Thank you so very, very much for joining us. Thank you to everybody who's tuned in. We really appreciate you joining in. It is the middle of Bourbon Heritage Month, so please feel free to tell us which Beam Bourbon you are drinking at any given time by using the hashtag Jim Beam Tasting Together over on Instagram. Please give a follow to Beam Bourbon Canada as well to keep up to date on all of the new releases we have coming here in Canada. Freddie, again, thank you so much for joining us. Hopefully we'll be able to get down to Kentucky and see you in person sooner than later. Good luck with the rest of the month, man. And to everybody watching at home, and to you, Freddie, cheers.
Cheers, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to listen tonight. I appreciate the opportunity.
Cheers.
Hope to see you soon.
Take care, dude.